Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Seltzer-Dunai, and I am a documentary filmmaker, and I'm today's guest host. And I'm here for the Sousa Mendes Foundation as a member of the Educational Committee. And I also am thrilled to be here because I have a connection with Victoria and her book, because her book inspired me. What happened was, when I had a chance to read the book in 2012, I was actually working on a documentary film that was about the steamship Quanza, which is featured in this book. And her father is one of the survivors on this steamship Quanza. And it also is a neat connection that my great uncle was one of the people that helped save them. He was a lawyer from Newport News, my hometown. So we're thrilled to have two accomplished writers here today, and just enabling something here. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Hanan. So Hanan Tigay is an award-winning journalist and nonfiction writer who has covered the Middle East, 9/11, and the United Nations for such outlets as The Atlantic, GQ, and The New Yorker. He most recently wrote an article for the Smithsonian featuring Olivia Mattis, our president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and it was about the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So you guys can all check that out. And we recently had an event where he was our guest speaker, and he was talking about his recent book called The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible. And you can find that really interesting discussion that we had with him on YouTube, and we're going to share that with you now. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor on to you, Hanan.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Laura. I'm really, really happy to be here this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. It's going to be a wonderful discussion, I'm sure. It is my honor to introduce our main attraction this afternoon, who's Victoria Redel. Victoria is a novelist, short story writer, poet, and a master teacher. I know the part about being a wonderful teacher almost firsthand, because Victoria was one of my wife's first and certainly favorite teachers in graduate school. Victoria is the author of 4 books of poetry and 5 books of fiction. Most recently is the book Paradise, which is a book of poems. It comes out this very week, I believe on Tuesday, and Victoria can correct me if I'm wrong, but Paradise is out this week. It's available for purchase, I know, on Amazon and elsewhere, so buy it early and buy it often. And of course, there's her brilliant book, The Border of Truth, which we're going to be discussing and hearing about here today. And just a little bit more about Victoria's work. It's been widely anthologized, awarded, and translated into 10 languages. Her debut novel, Loverboy, was adapted for a feature film that was directed by Kevin Bacon. And her short stories, poetry, and essays have appeared in Granta, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Bomb, One Story, and many, many others. So check those out if you can. Victoria has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Fine Arts Work Center. And she's a professor in the graduate and undergraduate creative writing programs at Sarah Lawrence College and lives in New York City. So Victoria, I'm really thrilled that I now get to ask you questions about your work. And the first thing I'm curious about is that as someone who writes journalism and nonfiction, I'm really fascinated by the impulse to turn part of your own family's true history into fiction. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the book, The Border of Truth, which does just that, about how you came to write it, and maybe a bit about how you went about taking real life events and turning them into this really beautiful and compelling novel.
Thank you, Hanan. It's fun actually to be on the other side of the table. It was great asking you questions. So I hope that I do as good a job as you did the other week. So what I thought would be interesting today is to give a really brief glimpse of the novel, The Border of Truth, and give the audience a little bit of the story without ruining the whole story for them, and intersperse sections of the book actual reading of the book, which I'll do at the end, but a little bit during, and also a bit at hinting at the background and the process of novel writing. The Border of Truth was, in a way, a book I knew I was always going to write. Both of my parents, under different circumstances, fled Europe during Hitler's invasion. After my first novel, I went to my dad. I was thinking about a second novel, and I told him I wanted to embark on a book that used his escape. I said, it's going to be a novel, not a historical representation of your family's flight. I wanted to be really clear with him that it meant that aspects of our family history was inevitably going to change under the demands of a novel. Maybe, for example, not everyone was going to make it to safety. People inside the novel were going to become characters acting and reacting to the pressures and the conflicts of outside forces and the needs and the conflicts between the characters inside the novel. It wasn't a biography. It wasn't a memoir of my family's history. The characters may not feel recognizable to my dad. And without hesitation, my dad said, sure. For better or worse, my dad had already witnessed how much I'd cannibalized parts of our family history and life in books and short stories and poems. And by now, he said he understood what fiction entailed, even when it used a kernel of personal biography. In that conversation, he generously gave me what I needed: his blessing to write the book and his willingness to be perhaps my primary research tool. So let me explain a little bit more about the rule I established with myself regarding history and facts. I could change my family history, but I couldn't change world events, by which I mean known events. I wouldn't change decisions and behaviors of any historical people who wound up as characters inside the novel. For a writer, the journey is really an inevitable spine for a novel. And my father and his parents' flight from Brussels in the back seat of a car of two strangers, 6 days on a completely congested road to the border of France, a trip that's maybe 130 miles, that under normal circumstances would take maybe a few hours. When he got to Paris, my father feared repatriation to Belgium, and because he turned 17, conscription into the Belgian army. When the Germans were just a few hours outside of Paris, my father and his parents fled south, despite orders that refugees go to the coast. And they finally made it through Spain to Portugal and onto a ship called the Quanza, a cargo ship that was being rerouted to New York and Mexico with over 300 people aboard. It's worth noting, since we're meeting under the auspices of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, that while my dad received his transit visa to Lisbon or to Portugal in Toulouse, it was officially under Sousa Mendes's orders that the consul in Toulouse gave out transit visas to Portugal, although my father had a slightly different story. In Lisbon, my dad pored over shipping routes in the university library. And when he'd heard of the Quanza bound for the Mexico, he understood how he could get his family to safety. They had already secured visas to Shanghai. As many people know, the game in Europe was to secure as many transit visas, as many visas as you could collect. He had Shanghai, they had Morocco, and he located on a shipping map a route from Mexico to Shanghai. And so he was able to get his family transit visas to Mexico. On August 9th, 3 months after the German invasion of Belgium, my father and both his parents were safe and happily aboard the Quanza. However, for some passengers, that presumption of safety was premature. And so this is where my novel, The Border of Truth, begins. The novel's hero is a really unlikely hero. It's 17-year-old Itsak Riddell. He's stuck aboard the Quanza with the remaining 86 other Jewish passengers who have all been denied entry, unable to disembark, first in New York, and then unable to disembark in Veracruz, Mexico, where the boat went next. And after floundering on the seas, the passengers begging Captain Arbert to bring them to port in Panama, to Nicaragua, anywhere, the ship has anchored in Hampton Road, Virginia, to bunker for coal and be sent back to Europe. My protagonist, Itsak, is in third-class steerage. He's a little bit of a dreamer. He's in love with the movies. And weirdly, he has with him his portable typewriter. It's his prized possession, and it's one of the few things he managed to bring with him when he fled his home. He's heard from others aboard that the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, might be their gate to sanctuary in America. Dear Eleanor Roosevelt, I hope you like stories, begins the novel. And it's the first of Itsak's obsessive letters to the First Lady. Hundreds of letters. Are they actually even being sent? In his many letters, he shares his and his other passengers' increasing desperation. Indeed, he starts one letter, "What news there is this morning, Mrs. Roosevelt? We've had a jumper." A Mr. Hilmar Wolf jumped the ship and attempted to swim to shore, only to be returned to the ship. But in his letters, Itsak also has other stories to tell, and he wants the First Lady's attention. He recounts his amazing adventures fleeing the Nazis as if he's a star in his own film. Though it wasn't exactly how he imagines it, he admits in a letter, he was glad to get out of Brussels and Paris. Yes, he's walked the streets of Paris. Though much of that was not as dapperly as he'd hoped. That's actually a picture of my father in Paris and one of the inspirations. In Paris, Itsak writes, I was a woman. I wanted to walk through Paris as a young man, dapper in a double-breasted suit. But because now I was a dodger of the Belgian army, because it was too dangerous, Mrs. Roosevelt, I wobbled in brown high heels down the Champs-Élysées, disguised in women's clothes. He has adventures to tell. He's snuck aboard trains without proper papers, and before getting caught, luck would have it, the train was bombed and he was saved in the ensuing chaos. There's been bribing of secretaries. He's experienced his first love affair on the trip, and in true cinema fashion, he was double-crossed and robbed by the woman. He also wants to consult Eleanor Roosevelt about her fashion choices. He tells her he knows from gloves. He has some fine leather ones actually in his possession since his father is a glove maker. Just as he offers her advice, he asks her for advice on his future when he comes ashore. Do you think Isaac will be a good name? He asks her. I mean, why only go from Itsak to Isaac? I could be Thomas or Charles or John or Frank or Fred. I could be Richard. I could be whatever name you think is the best name for an American man, Mrs. Roosevelt. But as the novel progresses, it also becomes clear that Itsak has a terrible secret, a betrayal, one he needs, however reluctantly, to confess to Eleanor Roosevelt, whom he's begun to call my American mother. So I want to pause a little bit from the plot to talk a bit about novel writing. A novelist is really always looking for the unexpected, for unexpected connections in her research that can be made use of in the novel. In just one of many inevitable coincidences I encountered in writing The Border of Truth, I learned that the actor Marcel Dalio and his wife Madeleine LeBeau were not only aboard the ship the Quanza, but among the 86 who were denied entry. We know Marcel Dalio, I think, as the actor in Renoir's films, The Grand Illusion and The Rules of the Game. His photograph in profile, his picture actually, a drawing in profile, was posted all over France actually by the Nazis as a typical Semitic face. We also know Madeleine LeBeau from her role as Yvonne in Casablanca. She was in love, but snubbed by Bogart, and she shows up drunk with the Nazi. Dalio was also in the film as a waiter. What serendipity, I thought. My character, Itsak, I had already decided was in love with the films, and now has a major French actor aboard the ship, and even more enticing, his beautiful and restless, much younger wife. For a writer, this kind of coincidence is just gold, and I made a lot of use of it. But back in the novel, on shore, Itsak and his passengers, his fellow passengers, are getting afraid that getting off the Quanza is increasingly being imperiled by the notoriously anti-Semitic duo, Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long. As an aside, not inside the book, but we have Breckinridge Long to thank for the idea of delay, 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 when in a long memo he wrote, we can, quote, this is a quote of Cordell Hull, of Breckinridge Longs, excuse me, we can delay and effectively stop for temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to very administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. Despite how dire and increasingly alone Itsak feels aboard the Quanza, he's also aware of forces on shore that might be working on his behalf. Most importantly, there's a quirky motorcycle riding lawyer, Jacob Morowitz, who's found this odd angled way of keeping the ship from returning to Europe. He's filed a breach of contract lawsuit to the tune of $100,000 against the shipping company, which includes Captain Arbert. But unbeknownst to Itsak, word has actually reached Eleanor Roosevelt, and through her pressures, Patrick Mallon from the State Department has been sent to the ship. An order is given to him to release children and people of importance. But to complicate the story even more for myself, as Itsak's story was unfolding in 1940 in letters to Eleanor Roosevelt, there was a second layer of the novel unfolding in 2003. And the book toggles back and forth between 1940 and 2003. So a little bit about 2003. In 2003, Sarah Leader is the daughter of a man named Richard Leader. She's single, she's in her 40s, she's a successful translator of the philosopher Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin killed himself on that same French and Spanish border, a border that Itsak will cross in Perpignan with much difficulty, and as happens throughout the novel, with a burst of luck. Sarah has decided to adopt as a single mother an orphan child from a country at war. But she's been told by the adoption agency, just as a child you'll adopt has a story, so you have a story. And it's important that you understand your history, where you came from, who were your great-great-grandparents. But what is her story? Sarah realizes she knows so little of her family history. Her father, Richard, has been adamantly silent about his past. She doesn't even really know what his name had originally been, which we, the readers of The Border of Truth, by now understand is Itsak. Our young Itsak Lisbon is now safe and in New York as Richard Leader. Or she doesn't understand exactly how he came to America during the war and what exactly happened to his parents, her grandparents. So Sarah becomes the reluctant detective of her father's past, and in doing so begins to see contemporary New York City with completely different eyes. Has she ever even really considered the immigration history of Carmen, her childhood nanny from El Salvador, or the charming and flirtatious Lebanese owner of the hair salon she frequents? What are the stories of all these immigrants in what she increasingly understands as a city of refugees? And why are so many reluctant to speak? At one point, she demands of Carmen, just tell me something about my father or you, even one small thing. And Carmen responds. Carmen comes and stands close to Sarah. She looks fierce, staring and keeping silent. And Sarah has to work from averting the gaze that Carmen's got her locked in. She can't read Carmen's face at all, a face she knows so well. And just when she thinks that this is it, that Carmen's going to stand there in a silent blockade, Carmen begins in a hard, deliberate voice. We left our town on foot, Carmen says. The bridges had been blown up. So even if we dared go in our car, we couldn't go in our car. And for a long time, I had to see again so many things in my dreams. I hated sleeping. I don't anymore, Sarah. There was a neighbor, a woman with 2 boys, and she was pregnant, having twins. When they buried her with the babies inside of her. There's your small thing, Sarah. Does it make you feel better? Most importantly, as she comes closer and closer to her father's past, she wrestles with what is most essential. To know in full her father's story, as she realizes there are others who do, or is the greatest act and gift of love not to know? To allow her father privacy, to allow him the private shames that might be the consequences of war, and to acknowledge and allow him to both protect himself and her from certain truths. I'm going to stop here and read a section from the novel, one of Itsak's letters, so you can meet Itsak firsthand. But before I do that, I think it's apt to give my father, Irving, a chance to say what his reaction was to having his life used, changed, distorted in the service of the novel. My father passed away in 2017, but this is a brief clip from an interview that Laura did when she was working on her documentary. The documentary, Nobody Wants Us.
What was it like to have your daughter write a story loosely based on your life or your experience on the Quanza?
I think it was great.
Tell me about it.
I think it was great. I thought that she did a wonderful job. She romanticized it one way or the other, like a novelist does. And sometimes I recognized myself in the story and sometimes I didn't. Either way, it was fine.
Did you feel that it brought you closer to her because you were telling, and maybe even opened your eyes to some of the past, just to remind you of some of the past? Or
it did reopen some of the thoughts of the past. I did not talk that much when they were children of my past. Refugees have a tendency of keeping a certain amount of insecurity in their lives. They believe it can always happen again. And some they travel from one country to the other, and it happened in those countries. And I was always afraid that I would give them that sense of insecurity that I had, and therefore did not, in all the years, discuss too much of the atrocities of some of the things. They figured that they'll go to college and they'll learn and find out in a more objective way.
That's so fun for me to see. So I'm going to read a little, one of Itsak's letters, and I chose this little section because it actually is in the consul in Toulouse, so it's somehow even still, although the events are very different than a Sousa Mendes release. And I think you've seen the sort of gravitas of my father, and now you'll see how someone becomes a character that's very different. An interesting little extra point is that the Quanza arrived in Hampton Bay on September 11th, 1940. And when I was writing, of course, by now, September 11th has a very different feeling to it, but it was one of those things that it's history, so you can't change that. So it's 3:15. He's written her around 6 prior letters. Hello, Mrs. Roosevelt. It's me, Isaac. So have you thought about those gloves? I'm not joking that I've come to trust gloves and hats. Take Toulouse. At the Portuguese consulate, it was finally a hat that did the trick. Maman and I waited in the Portuguese consulate for 2 long afternoons. The waiting room was large with open, unshuttered windows and 3 clacking ceiling fans. But it was unbearably warm, and with all of us crowded on the sticky benches or waiting in silent clusters, it seemed there was not sufficient air. We waited for 2 full afternoons before our names were called. Maman and I were then shown into the consul's office. Monsieur, Maman began, edging closer to his heavy wood desk. The man, he was the very caricature of the bureaucrat, the porcine petit bourgeois. He hardly raised a snout to look at her. Madame, let me make it quick. There are no visas, transit or otherwise, at my disposal. His fat lips choose his words like they were spring truffles. There was a wet sheen above his lip and on the bulb of his nose. Mais monsieur, she said, pushing closer. Her hand moved to touch the brass paperweight as if holding that heavy object would help balance her. We were told you could. The snout raised a little, but only a little to interrupt. Well, I'm telling you now, madame, there's no shortage of people who were told no shortage of incorrect information, and I had no visa to give them or you. Monsieur, we were told, maman repeated. Her fingers brushed across the loose papers and folders as if she were ready to straighten up the consul's desk. Something had to be done. In the game of visas, you must understand that securing Portugal might help claim a transit visa for Spain, France to Spain, to Portugal, to Morocco or Mexico or Shanghai. The strategy was to create options. I stepped in, I took Maman's hand, but she yanked it away from me like I was a restless child distracting her from urgent business. I made a bit of a scene then, nothing extreme, nothing loud or physical, though I would have done anything to get us out of his office. Izzy, have you lost your mind? She managed to ask me once we were back in the waiting room. 2 days we waited to get in his office. Have you lost your mind? Indeed, if you had seen me out in the center of the waiting room, you might have agreed with Maman, Mrs. Roosevelt. I was smiling, a little Fred Astaire, satisfied smile, head up, puffed chest, shoulders pressed back as I let go of Maman's hand, and with a turn and a kick, I strutted my way over to the consul's secretary. Let me say with some discretion now that due to long hours of waiting, I'd had the opportunity to notice the evident talents that recommended this woman for the position of the Portuguese consul's secretary. Her clothes seemed to be all darts and buttons, fastened mostly to show what they could not contain. If the consul was a character of one kind, then the secretary seated at her desk, adjusting the seams of her stockings, was her own remarkable kind, and as the expression goes, a pair out of central casting. I bent close, my elbows leaning on her metal desk. Mademoiselle, is it always this warm in Toulouse? It seems hardly bearable to wear cloth against the flesh. Or might there be a time, perhaps an early spring night, when a woman might be comfortably in need of a fur? Behind me, I could feel Maman bristling, restless with fury. Hot or cold, doesn't a woman always need a fur? The secretary answered, making me almost think she'd been given my script in advance. From there, we chatted about furs. I don't know a thing about furs, but I know my leather, and that appeared to work fine. I asked questions. She fancied a fox and a mink. She thought rabbit and seal were respectively cute and drab. She loved the elegant look of a fox paw. Her name, I learned, was Veronique. I said, may I call you Veronica Lake? She pulled her blonde hair over one eye, tilted her head and said, how's that? Veronica, I asked, is the consul an agreeable man? She laughed and her hair shook in place. I'd say that like most men, given the right circumstance, he's most agreeable. I pulled back and let my head tilt, hopefully a bit rakishly. I bet Veronica, and here I had no choice but to take the full risk, that you're a person who could provide the nearly perfect circumstances that make Monsieur the Consul most agreeable. Maman drew a sharp, astonished breath. The room behind me became intensely quiet, not a movement from any waiting on a bench. Veronique gave a bold laugh. I'm not sure about nearly perfect, sweetheart. I say when I provide a circumstance, it's either entirely perfect or not. She was indeed all fast-tongued, Veronica Lake. Of course, I apologize, I said, fearless now, my tone soft and conspiratorial. My mother and I, we'd love to give you a wonderful gift, a stole, perhaps a fox stole, a gift of appreciation for making it possible, a circumstance where Monsieur the Consul would sign the transit visa for us. Veronique stood. She kept me riveted in her gaze, and in that moment, it was clear I'd miscalculated. A slap, a hurl of interest, insults, perhaps even shrieks to call in the gendarmes might close this movie scene. And also a fox hat, I rushed, because there wasn't a clear way of backing out. I needed to keep speaking. I believe something with a little height maybe and a tilt would be a good match to the stole and really agreeable for your face. And of course, a pair of kid gloves. Perhaps, mademoiselle, you'd prefer to make your own selection of pelts. We can provide for that as well. She leaned close and I waited for what she might hiss at me. Instead, she placed a kiss, a light, delicate kiss on my jaw. You and your mother are most kind. I do think choosing for myself will be best, although I appreciate your notice of my face," she said, her mouth lingering against my cheek. She straightened, she patted down her blouse, and in an official and measured voice said, "The monsieur says your papers will be completed and stamped by 6. Come back then. Perhaps we'll both be able to surprise one another with our skills. And that, Mrs. Roosevelt, is what I mean about the power of gloves and hats." So this is how by evening we were in possession of a Portuguese transit visa, but I'm rushing ahead and I shouldn't be telling you about Toulouse, forget about Spain, when we're not even out of Brussels yet. Getting everything out of order, it's no way to tell a story, is it? And please, please, I am not comparing you to a secretary in Toulouse, Mrs. Roosevelt. I'm just talking gloves, if you know what I mean. Your most loyal, Isaac Astaire. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. That was wonderful. And I always love getting a chance to hear the author read their own words. So we really get a sense of what you had in your mind as you were writing it. And I'm also really glad we got a chance to see a clip of your father in the flesh. You said that the greatest and first piece of research that you did for this book was interviewing your father. And so many people who experienced World War II were extremely reluctant to discuss their experiences. And your father so articulately explained exactly why he felt that way. And I wonder if you can, given that, talk to us about what it was like interviewing him. Suddenly he becomes your subject. You know, how did those interactions go, and what kinds of questions did you actually end up asking him?
It was amazing, Hanan. You know, I'm sure my kids would probably say the same about me, but the stories I did know were sort of the same 4 stories my father would tell. And that's not sufficient in a novel, right? A novel isn't really made up of a string of events. It's made up of the texture of life. And so I was in the situation when I would meet with my dad. Sometimes we'd meet over lunch and I'd say, "Dad, can you tell me, did you ever go on vacation?" It was never a question I'd thought to ask my father. "When you were a child, where'd you go? Did you ever go on a holiday?" And then my father would talk about Coq-sur-Mer. And I'd say, "What was in Coq-sur-Mer?" And then I'd learn about a girl and boats. And, or I would say to my dad, "Did you have a uniform for school?" And I would watch, you know, my father probably hadn't thought about his school uniform in 70 years, 80 years. And suddenly I'm watching memory move through my father's face. And what he said was, it was so itchy, right? It went right to the physical. So there was so much of it that was the unexpected texture of my father's life that I began to learn about. So the passage I just read, that little piece of what is a fanciful story, and it doesn't 100% align with what we know of Sousa Mendes, who he was in Bordeaux, but under his command, other consuls throughout the country also released information. But I did learn from my father that his family had bribed the secretary to help them get a transit visa with the offer of furs. So that was one of the things that that came up, and I was able to ask about it. And from there, you know, obviously, I do what a writer does, which was begin to invent. But once I began to hear about that, I began to think about what the room was like where he was, or what that consul was. Now, whether he was or wasn't that, it wasn't my job. I'm in novel mode.
Yeah, I love the way those little details, when you ask about them, can trigger memories, of the little details, but then that triggers something even bigger and more profound for the person you're asking.
I've often said to writing students of mine, or just young people, you know, that, you know, they're always given these tasks like, go ask your grandma about their life, or something, you know, and the story doesn't necessarily provide that they come up with a full vision for the young person to hold on to. So it's almost as if you have to ask these crazy questions. Like when I decided that that Itsak was into the movies, it then led me to be able to ask my father, to find out what were movies that he might have seen in Belgium, not when he came to the United States, right? Or were you into the movies, Dad? Who did you like? Well, he immediately went, oh, I loved Robin Hood. I saw that in Belgium. And I loved, Olivia, I'm blanking now, de Holland. No, I've gotten her name wrong right now. But, and so then I went back and looked at Robin Hood, and there were ways that it wound up fitting into the novel. So.
Yeah, that process is amazing. I know that you initially, we just heard one of these wonderful letters that appear in the novel, and you initially envisioned the novel as a much shorter book, but totally epistolary. It was all made up of these letters. I think you said 150 pages of them, letters to Eleanor Roosevelt, but ultimately, of course, it became a very different book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that process, or how your initial vision of what this book was going to be ended up, somewhere completely different.
Absolutely. So I had started the book, and I'd said to my agent, I wanted to be an epistolary novel, just letters. And he was like, great, just a short novel. And I was like, yeah, just a short novel. And then one day I was walking across, I wrote a good deal of that book at the New York Society Library. So I was walking across Central Park, and I had this idea of a woman in her 40s trying to adopt. I had wrestled with the question of what's the importance of this as a novel about the Quanza. And suddenly when I saw this contemporary woman, I understood that it was more than a novel about the Quanza situation or the Second World War or the Holocaust, that it was a larger question about refugees and contemporary refugees. And obviously a ship like the Quanza echoes some of the questions of refugees on many borders across the world. And so I began to think of that. And then there was, as I said in the talk, there was another coincidence that happened. I went into what was a furniture store, a furniture repair shop on Amsterdam Avenue one day, and after working on the novel, just soon after I'd had this image of this woman, Sarah, and I started thinking maybe this book has to go back and forth. And I somehow gave the man at the desk my name, and a woman came up to me and said, "Is Irving Riddell your father?" And I said, "Yeah." I figured she knew him from business or something. And she said, "I don't know if my name will mean anything. Have you ever heard of my father, Maurice Goldenhar?" Well, the Goldenhar family was a family that traveled with my family from Brussels through all the way onto the Quanza. These two families traveled as they could together. And in fact, Maurice, the Goldenhars were now already characters inside of my book. Maurice was Henri. He's the character Henri. And so I looked up at Francine Goldenhar, and I didn't know what she was going to say. And I said, "Francine, this is going to sound so weird, but I've just come from a day of writing, and your father and my father are standing on a hillside, in Brussels, having been on the road for 6 days, smoking cigarettes." And she looked at me, and I began to explain to her that I was writing the novel. And so Sarah's story kind of emerged out of that. And I gave the first draft. At first, it was only like 30 pages of Sarah kind of laced through the book. I gave it to my agent, and he said to me, "Well, okay, there's good news and bad news. The good news is I really like the character of Sarah, and she's really important. And the bad news is now you have to write the half of the novel that's not in here when you write your second draft." And in a substantial way, this book became Sarah's book, because it becomes her story to try to understand what are the consequences of war, what are the casualties of war, what are the choices that a person has to make, and how will she reconcile that as the next generation. So those were some of the questions.
I'm going to break for a quick moment for the Sousa Mendes Foundation from this really interesting dialogue to make a couple brief announcements. And then if you guys can also be thinking about questions that you have for Victoria, she'll be able to answer some of those. let's see. So next Sunday, February 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is 8 p.m. in Paris, Rose Balloon, the art spy is the topic. Tickets are required by donation only, and any amount is welcome. No donation is too small, so don't let that deter you. It's in the brief description of the event, the museum curator, who was Rose, worked and became, the museum that Rose worked at became the main depot of art looted by the Nazis. She was a young French curator who kept meticulous notes, and thanks to her actions, thousands of these paintings were recovered after the war. So it sounds like a really interesting discussion that will be on that day. The following event is on, gosh, I'm so sorry about that. And the following event is Sunday, February 27th, Shimon's Return. And Shimon's Returns, and that's at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is 9 p.m. in Israel. And there's a film rental and then a free discussion. And once you sign in, you'll get all the details. And that is a documentary film that tells the story of Szymon Redel, a hidden child during the Holocaust who returns to a place from his childhood in Poland and the Ukraine to thank his rescuers. So a real beautiful story. And that'll be moderated by Richard Horowitz, the author of a forthcoming book about Holocaust refugees. And last but not least, I'd like to announce also, I'd like to just thank you all so much for your generous contributions. That's the Sousa Mendes campaign is helping distribute the Nobody Wants Us film that is based, really, a lot of it is, Victoria's book is loosely based on some of those actual events. So that documentary is being distributed to schools around the country, and we have distributed to 46 more schools thanks to many of you contributing the film. And you can, we're going to post in the chat right now where you can make that, where you can get information about that. And you can also dedicate the film in the name of a loved one. So we are now I'm going to pass it back to you guys, and you guys can continue with your dialogue.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. So I'm going to ask another question in a sec, but first, Laura mentioned that if you have questions, you should feel free to ask them. And the way to do that would be by putting them into the chat. And I will be looking at those and get to as many of them as I possibly can. And a few of them are already coming in addition to many compliments, Victoria, about your work. So you should look at that later on. Victoria, the LA Times, I was looking through some reviews, and the Times review said that The Border of Truth is such a good novel that it could also be any American's story. And I'm curious if that comment resonates with you. Did you, as you were working on this, did you see yourself as writing a quintessentially American novel? Was that sort of ever a thought in your head?
Well, no, it's a great compliment. So it was moving to me when I read that. And it was important for me to think that Itsak's story was connected to the story of Carmen, for example, in the book, a Salvadoran woman, or someone who left Lebanon during the war in Lebanon, or anybody who has fled from from any of the many countries that have been at war, from the Balkan countries, from African countries, and who arrive here with a vision of America. I think there's a whole generation now of first generation writers, of which I am also one of, and so many of those stories, I've thought quite a bit, looked at similarities between first generation Jewish writers, first generation Vietnamese writers, or we didn't name the country. And I think there are a lot of similarities. And one of them is this sense of that protection, and yet also the sense of, even inside of, how beautifully my dad said that, but there was also inside of my family a feeling of inherent disaster, that we were all sort of an impending disaster. It wasn't that they shared that information, either parent, and yet I think that is part of it. We were encouraged to assimilate, and yet our assimilation was also seen as dangerous by our parents. So, conflicting messages, and I think that's true inside of the literature of New Americans.
Yeah, and a related question, Victoria, coming from the audience. Someone said, I believe you said something about a central theme or conflict in your book, which you expressed along the lines of to seek to know or to respect the need of refugees for privacy. This strikes me as being one of the most common second-generation experiences. As a fiction writer, do you think that the fiction itself versus telling a nonfiction story is a way of protection and of retaining and respecting such a boundary?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, that's Sarah's conundrum in the story, right? She goes seeking. She really goes looking for the information. She reluctantly, but then she goes seeking it. And the more she finds out, I mean, she comes upon people who know information about her father. Her father seems to, Itsak or Richard has gone places and talked about the Holocaust, and he's gone to schools, and yet he's protected his daughter. And so she becomes kind of enraged a little bit, like, why doesn't she know? Why doesn't she know? And at a certain point, she finds her way to a museum where he has given certain documents, and she learns there's a big parcel of letters, and and with it comes a note from him which says it's your choice sort of question, and she's trying to reckon with, what does that mean? She wants to know, and yet she doesn't want to know. And certainly that is the essential question inside of families, right? There are families. What do we all need to know each other's family secrets? Does the family need to in order to move forward? Or in some sense, is Itsak's choice to protect his daughter something that she should manage and hold to her? I'm not sure. Am I answering it fully enough, Hanan?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a fascinating, a great question and an amazing answer. I'm one of the things I am curious about is, we got your father's reaction to your book a little bit, right? He said, she did a nice job. And I'm wondering if you've gotten a response from other Quanza families to the book and what they thought of it.
Well, I remember my whole thing about how much I was going to learn or not learn, or history. So, for example, when I ran into Francine Goldenhar, and there was Henri on the hill still with Itsak, but I wasn't sure what was going to happen with Henri in the novel. I wasn't sure, just as I wasn't sure whether Itsak's family was going to be able to stay intact during the flight out of Europe and to safety. I wasn't sure yet what was really going to happen to Henri's family. And he was a character in my book, but as I was seeing Francine, I thought, that's her dad. I've created a character of her dad. And so I sort of said to her, this is what the book is, and I'm not really sure what's going to happen. It didn't take much for her to understand it. She's a smart literary person, and she is well-read. And then her mom, who my father also knew from Belgium, Maurice, Maurice had passed away. But when I spoke with Paul, I actually got a letter from Paulette that said, you've captured the anxiety that we all had. Your father must have talked to you so much about this because you captured this so perfectly. And I felt fine. And then the second one is I'd learned from, when I learned that Madeleine Lebeau was on the ship, Francine actually shared with me a little piece of information about somebody's somebody she'd spoken with whose brother had some kind of a tryst with Madeleine LeBeau aboard the ship. Well, that was also too good not to use. And so there's a tryst with Madeleine LeBeau aboard the ship. I'm not going to say much because I want people to read the book and not blow everything about the book. But I then met the woman. So the book is about to come out, and I go to have a drink with someone who has reached out to me and says, I hear that you have a book coming out, and I was aboard the Quanza. And from her, she said, well, I want to share with you something. My brother, who was quite young, had a rendezvous with Madeleine LeBeau aboard the ship. So then I was in the position of saying, I kind of heard about that, Nina, but I got to tell you, I stole that and used that. And Itsak has a little romance with Madeleine LeBeau. So everyone was really great. People came out of the woodwork. I met the daughter of the jumper, who knew nothing about her father's life. And his story of why he was on the ship was so much better than what I had invented inside the novel. So it was great.
That's amazing. I know that whenever I put something out into the world writing wise, it's about real people, I'm just terrified about what I messed up and what they're going to be mad at me about. And I can imagine how gratifying it must be for you to hear something like that sense of anxiety, you captured it perfectly.
Yeah.
That must have just made you feel like my work here is done.
It was great.
Amazing. A question from the chat: does FDR turn up in your novel? And was Eleanor Roosevelt more sympathetic to helping Jewish refugees than FDR was?
Well, yes. FDR had a complicated relationship with refugees. He was certainly under the sway of Cordell Hull and Breckinridge Long. And as we all know, they had been instrumental in sending the St. Louis away, right? Which had happened prior to, well, I forget exactly the date on the St. Louis, 38, 39, I think it is. And so Eleanor Roosevelt had been horrified when she understood what had happened with the St. Louis. And so this was an opportunity, the Quanza became an opportunity for her to kind of rectify a mistake she had made. And so she did an around Long and Hull, and kept insisting to her husband, to FDR, that they needed help. And she literally waited until Hull and Long were kind of off with their attention on something else to get them to send Patrick Mallon down. And Patrick Mallon is one of the great heroes of the Quanza. Patrick Mallon went down, and he was given that order that he could let children and people of importance off the ship. And he went down there and he began to interview the 86 passengers, at which point he said, I don't have sufficient time to decide who is a person of importance. And so he allowed everybody to come to shore as a political refugee. And it was his work, tied with the lawyer Morowitz, who kept the ship in place so that Eleanor Roosevelt could. But FDR had a complicated relationship to refugees. We were admitting at that point into America, I don't know, I forget what the percentage is right now. I used to know this kind of information pretty well when I was researching the book, but if you were allowed to let in 100,000 refugees a year, we were letting in like 20. So the proportions were way off, as they had been sort of, for example, under the last presidential administration, where they pulled way back on allowing refugees into the country.
There's just so much resonance between what happens in your book and what is happening in this country today. So I urge anyone who read this book when it came out to read it again with fresh eyes, because I think you'll see much new in it. And one more question, if I can. You referred to Sarah in your book as a detective of her father's past, which of course is exactly what you were in writing this book. And of course, Sarah is not you, but did you bring elements of yourself to that character? Did you bring elements of your experience interviewing your father to that character?
Well, I think some people would argue that every character inside of a book has elements of the novelist. So Sarah does, I'm sure, have elements of me. Her circumstances are really different than mine are. But yes, as she was going about trying to understand things, I was doing the same kind of process with my dad of learning, so much more about his life than I'd ever known. I think we think of survivors or refugees. Probably my father described one camp, and the other camp of people, or the other group of people, are people who want to talk about it a lot and who share a lot. My father was not in that category. And so I had really, but he was at a point in his life where he was open to it, and he really had he had a great time. He remembered himself. He remembered his life much more fully, I think, as he and I went through it.
Yeah. So if you'll permit me a sort of writerly question, one of the things I loved so much about this book was that Itsak's letters were at once felt like they could really be real letters that a real person wrote. They just felt very authentic to me, and yet retained a literary quality, so that this wasn't just, it didn't feel like off the top of someone's head the first thing they thought of went out on the page. And that's a really hard balance, I think, to pull off as a writer, to make it literary and yet to also make it seem authentic. And I wonder if that was something, did that come naturally to you? Is that something you thought about? Did you struggle to make it feel that way?
In the early writing of the book, I hadn't figured out that it was going to be told in letters. And so it was probably, I was about 30 pages into a third person. So he did this, and I was writing a different book, and it was dull. It was dull. And really one day walking down the street, I heard, "Dear Eleanor Roosevelt, do you like stories?" I was walking down the street and I heard that voice, and I thought, oh, it's Itsak. He's a kid. It's his story. And well, once I got this kind of funny, excited boy, I thought, oh, a 17-year-old boy. Yeah, Brussels is being bombed. That's horrible. But he saw Brussels as provincial. He wanted out. He's a kid. He wants Paris. He wants New York. This is an opportunity. And once I got that, I kind of could hear the sound of him all the time. And so if I could just yield to the sound of him and try not to think about being writerly, try not to think about being literary, but inhabit voice, which I guess is also a writerly thing, to figure out how to inhabit your character.
Yeah. You mentioned something when we discussed this earlier, Victoria, about the novel after the novel. Mm-hmm. I think what you're referring to, I think you've begun sort of getting at that in some of the other answers, but can you talk about what you mean by the novel after the novel?
Well, in a novel like this, there was so many beautiful things that happened afterwards, right? I re-met the other remaining passengers on the Quanza who were alive. I brought them together. They all had lunch together. Then people showed up. So this woman, after a piece was written in the New York Times, this woman writes me and says, "I have a feeling my father was the jumper. I don't know much about her life. Would you meet me?" And then I heard this remarkable, very complicated family story of hers that had a lot of secrecy in it as well. I met another woman from Washington, a kind of very well-respected socialite, and who had been aboard the Quanza and had kept it a secret from everyone in her life because of not wanting to be seen as a refugee. I think she married a non-Jewish person and sort of took another path in her life. And this coming into contact with this opened it up. And so I learned a whole bunch about her. I encountered So there were all of these stories, all of these coincidences that kept coming. When I met Nina Minus, who had been aboard the ship, her and her brother, who was the person who had, Nina's brother was the person who had the tryst with Madeleine LeBeau. I'm telling tales out of school, but both people are, he had no problem with that story. I think he was quite proud of it. And so all those things kept coming, as if like this like there was another novel, which was once that book got put into the world, the way other people came towards it. Additionally, the one last thing I would say is that I had the great good fortune to read several times. The first place I read was kind of around Passover at a retreat, and after my reading, a woman came up to me, a very beautiful older woman, who said, I'm like Itsak. And pulled up her sleeve, and there were her numbers on her arm, and she said, I will not tell my children about any of it. I have not told them, even though they want to. Do you think I should? Maybe I could. And that was unbelievable. She said to me, maybe you could tell my children. And I said, no, let's talk about how you can. So it was remarkable and beautiful that way for me.
Thank you so much for this really interesting, enlightening conversation. We're at the hour mark, and I just don't want to let it slide. That I want everyone to know where you can get the book. So if you could post that, Michael, you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, support your local bookstores. And once again, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Victoria. This is wonderful.
Thank you, Hanan. It was really fun to talk with you.
It's a pleasure.